I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 4 of our study, which covers the Book of Genesis, Chapter 4. So far, in the Book of Genesis, we have dealt with abstract myth about the origins of humanity and our relationship with God. And all of that stuff about the garden and being kicked out of the garden. So as we pick up here, this is a bit of a transition point out of that myth and those themes into what is it like for us living in the world and not the garden. So and we had two people before created by God, and now we're going to start having directly created by God, and now we're going to start having people born in the ordinary fashion. So a lot of things are transitioning out of that myth and moving us toward something more familiar and more relatable, although it takes a while to get to this is just people living normal earthly lives, and we don't get all the way to that from here. By way of setting things up, first point, because it's disorienting, we are going to see as our chosen family moves out into the world that they're interacting with other people. If we take what's been said in Genesis literally, that is not really possible, right? Which should not be disconcerting. Because again, this is an origin myth. And it's not meant to be everything exactly factually what happened. It's conveying those deep and profound realities about who we are and our relationship with God. So don't let it throw you, but the text in Genesis itself doesn't think that Adam and Eve and their descendants were the only people that existed either. They are unique in their relationship with God, and that comes to reign over all of humanity, even the ones or apply to all of humanity, even the ones that aren't them. So just getting that out of the way. Won't visit on it or dwell on it more when we see other people. Of course we do, because these are some people in a world full of people. Don't let that throw you. That's just the reality of the situation. So that's the boring part, right? Just making sure that we're on the same page of this is weird, and that's why. The interesting part. So far in the book of Genesis, there have been two people, and they were both created by God. Now we start to have new people. And we start to get a look at what that is like. Adam and Eve were created without sin by God. And then they sinned, and now we have more people. So what's that going to look like, and how is it going to work for these new people who are born with that strange relationship with God? This is very relevant to us, because we are those people born into a strange relationship with God. And we're going to see further sin beyond the sin of Adam and Eve. And so what does that mean for God, for the sinner, for the relationship between the two, right? We have one instance right now of here are some people. They committed a sin. This is what happened. That provides a bit of a template, but what's going to happen next when it's not them and it's somebody else? And what was the effect on further humanity of the sin that occurred in the garden? These are things we kind of take for granted because, we know the spoilers of a lot of this. But from a narrative and from a Genesis point of view, we don't know any of that, right? This is all brand new. And so how do we deal with this? We're also going to set up a theme that is incredibly important in all of the scriptures, even further in the book of Genesis, which is the firstborn is not always the preferred, and is not always the good one, and is not always where favor lies. And for us, that seems obvious, right? Oh, duh. Of course, like, parents love all their children equally, right? And like, there's nothing really special in our society, typically, where the firstborn has any kind of unique right or privilege. So for us, it's kind of a wash most of the time now with decent parents. But back then it was like, there was a strong, like, the norm was that the firstborn, like, that's the thing, right? That's how the legacy, the name, the family continues. Like, for right away to start seeing that not true, that is an important divergence from the mindset. It's important that that's happening, right? The important thing isn't that most of the time the firstborn is preferred, because that was just a normal cultural thing. The important and relevant thing is, in God's eyes, that's not always true. And that your birth doesn't dictate your favor with God, or where God's blessing lies. It also, right here, right away from the beginning, foreshadows and sets up a theme that is so important, which is, in a way, God had two sons, right? Only one was born, only one was begotten, one was created and not really quite a son, right? But God's first human was Adam, right? Though not son, was still, like, you'd think, here's the first one, here's where favor lies, right? Like, this is the big deal. And this is, of course, how everything is going to go. But not true. And then you have the second one, who is a son, who is favored, on whom God's favor lies, and through whom God brings about what his plan is. And if we want to stretch the metaphor, the first son, or the descendants of the first son, kill the second son out of jealousy. Spoiler, that's what happens here too, right? So this story is not only about the first two born humans and how they don't get along with one another, but it's about God's children and how we have gotten along with one another. And it foreshadows an important part of our salvation here from the beginning as well. So those are, I would say, the big themes here that we're going to get into. There are a few small things along the way, but that's the big part of this story that we'll kind of walk through. The other thing to note is we start to get into the first of very, very many of these series of genealogy. Some of that can be interesting, some of it less so, but it's important to the framing of the story, and some of it matters. So when it's going to matter, we'll spend a little more time on it, not here. And when it's not going to matter that much, we're not going to get into it too much. But a lot of that, as we'll see here, takes on some of that mythical aspect to it as well, and is what it is. Kind of interesting, but not a thing we're going to spend a lot of time on. This bit is both the necessary setup for the things that are going to occur, and really important in its own right. All of the people so far in our story have been made directly by God. Now, after the fall and the exile from the garden, we have people coming about in the now more traditional way. So Adam and Eve are having children. They didn't have children in the garden. Doesn't matter that much, but it's an interesting point. While they were living eternally in paradise, before death enters, you also don't really need procreation, right? You had two eternal people, and then it's after the point that they're going to die that now they're also procreating, right? You have, out of that death, you also have a kind of life that comes about to bring about continuation of the species and God's vision of redemption of humanity. So even though the childbirth thing is brought up as a part of a curse, as they're being exiled from the garden, it is also a tremendous blessing that they're now able to be more people, and God's plan for salvation can continue and to progress. As we'll see later in this very chapter, sometimes the thing that God does that looks like it could be a curse can actually be a tremendous blessing, even if it's not particularly the thing that we want. So we have two new people. Cain is the elder and Abel is the younger. And we skip all of their upbringing and all of that, and we get to them choosing professions. The book of Genesis is kind of interesting about jobs, right? God has been portrayed already as a craftsman in his own right. And now we have a keeper of sheep and a tiller of the soil. We'll see more. There's a clear bias in the book of Genesis that the keeper of livestock is good and a farmer is bad. The reason for that is something to the effect of, these were generally traveling people. In the early world, there was an idea that when people settle and start building cities, it becomes a place of sin and wickedness. It's going to be a theme throughout at least all of Genesis. And it's hard to argue even today. You get too many people together in that kind of area, bad things can happen, right? It's not necessary, but even now we tend to think the big city is like crime-ridden and all of these things. And of course, small towns aren't like that at all, which is not true, but it's still in our consciousness that collectively that's a thing, right? This attitude has never really gone away. So if you want to, be a good upstanding citizen, you'll just wander around with your sheep, not settle in, make roots, get too close to your neighbors, and let any of that sin catch up with you. And if you, are lazy and ready to settle in and get started sinning, then you can settle down and plant some crops. We'll come back around and we'll see it more and more in the book, right? That's over-reductive, of course, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind because there's a big question here in the next passage that is a little hard for us to understand. So the starting point is that Cain is a farmer and Abel is a shepherd. Here we see another really interesting development that I think is glossed over a lot when people look at this passage, which is we know something very important about humanity's relationship with God based on what happens here. In the garden, God gave everything to people and they gave nothing back. Now that they have been exiled from the garden, there seems to be an expectation all of a sudden that people are giving offerings to God. That just changed. And it's treated as assumed, so it's really easy to read over it. But why would that be? It was easy in the garden and you had plenty. So it could have been really easy to, pick up a sheep and say, here, God, here's your sheep. But it also wouldn't have meant anything because they didn't do anything for it, right? Like, here now is the idea that now that you've been cursed to horrible labor and toil for all of your days, God is entitled to a part of the toil to which you are cursed. Okay, God, where was that in the mention of all of this toil? That I not only have to work to support me, but you also. When you've demonstrated that you have this great abundance and don't need anything. Like, what, God? This seems like a very raw deal, right? Now I have to work for the first time to support me, and you want me to give things to you as well. That is a quite an interesting thing that slips in, huh? And one could see how it might breed a little bit of resentment. Think about maybe I'm the only one who occasionally gets a little bit prickly about this. But so we're asked to tithe. That makes sense, right? Support the needs of the church. I do work. I give to God and the church out of the work that I do. And I give 10% or more. But then we have things come around, like the diocese has a capital campaign or an appeal, and there start to be these things, and they suggest amounts of money that they think I should definitely be able to give with no knowledge or context about my budget or financial situation. And all of a sudden, I start to think, really? You seem a little entitled right now to some of what I feel like is mine. And really? And the problem with that, I'm not saying that everything about that approach from the diocese is good, because I don't necessarily think that was handled the best it could have been. But the bigger problem there is that I have this idea that the things that I'm working for are mine. And that is an incorrect view of how things are, right? Like, it's an inherently selfish mindset and view. I did the work, so this stuff is mine. Great. But you planted some seeds in the ground, and then you hoed them a little bit, and then it rained, and the soil provided nutrients, and bam, corn. You did that work? Where did the rain come from? Where did the nutrients come from? Where did the seed come from? You did all of that by yourself, huh? And that's yours to keep because you made all of that happen by yourself. Or I go to the job that was an unbelievably blessed opportunity that I got, and the same thing applies in my situation. Like, I'm so blessed to be where I am and to have the opportunities that I do, and I am not earning that money by myself of my own merits and ability. I contribute, right? We're collaborating with God in production of things. So God should have a share in the proceed because he has a share in the work and in the opportunity. But when I think I did this is mine, then it creates a very unhealthy view and attachment to the things, right? So there is inherently from the beginning this assumption that, of course, a portion of all of this stuff that I generate is mine. And of course, a portion of it is God's, because I didn't generate it on my own. I think that's Cain's problem. So what does Abel bring? I'm going backwards in the text because I think it makes it easier to make sense. Abel brings some of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. There's an idea that the firstlings are better and the fat parts are the good parts, right? When we get into animal sacrifice, it's a big deal that when and if, what happens with the fatty portions. And there are certain sacrifices where you can only offer a firstling, right? Because it's better. So Abel has correctly internalized this idea that I want to give to God the best parts of what I've done. Cain brings an offering of the fruit of the ground. It doesn't explicitly say that that's like a terrible offering, but it doesn't say it's like the first fruits of the harvest. Like some of those other things that later come up also in the language of sacrifice, having to do with produce and specifying which produce is okay to offer, it doesn't associate here with Cain's offering. And it does associate those terms with Abel's offering. So while it doesn't, the text doesn't explicitly say Cain brought the leftovers and Abel brought the good stuff, it's implied. And that would explain this, right? It seems to me that Cain has the idea that I guess I have to give some stuff to God. So this stuff looks great. I'm going to put that in my storeroom. And then what, isn't as good or what can I spare? God doesn't need it anyway. I'm going to give this part to God. Very easy human attitude to have, right? And it's a thing I have to check myself on, and a lot of us probably do have to check ourselves on, that we tend to treat the things we have as though they're ours and feel selfish about wanting to keep them instead of giving them to God. The attitude we'll see here is that is, while not in and of itself necessarily a mortal sin, it is a perilous attitude, and it can be problematic. And that's what God has no regard for Cain's offering, and he likes Abel's offering. And it's not because God is a carnivore or likes the taste of meat better. It's because, or even because Cain is a farmer and Abel is a shepherd, even though, as I said, that is a thing. It's because one of them approached the offering with the spirit that God wants, and the other didn't. That is the part of this that's our takeaway, right? If we make an offering to God and we're holding back, we're kind of, why are you doing it at all if you're holding back, right? Like, you're arguably, with the text here to support it, not benefiting yourself at all if you're holding back and you're doing it, and you're losing stuff. So the takeaway here isn't Matthew said I shouldn't make offerings to God. Not the takeaway. The takeaway is when we offer to God, we should be giving the best of what we have and not holding back, because what's ours is also his. And this idea, again, I'm not saying we should be communist and have all things in common either, but everything that is ours is surely also God's. And if he thinks that, your coat would look better on your neighbor who's cold in the winter, then maybe that would be a good thing to reallocate. Not because it belongs to your neighbor also, but because it belongs to God also. And God might think that would be a good place to store his coat. It's the attitude of ownership is an interesting thing for us as Christians when we acknowledge that God reigns over everything. So I think that's the reason why, and the text doesn't make it super clear, so this is kind of a bit of your own interpretation, but I think that's how we get to the idea of God not liking Cain's offering and God being pleased with that of Abel. Here God immediately challenges Cain's reaction, right? Cain's reaction, I'll say, is also intimately tied in with the attitude that caused the problem to begin with. He is not ashamed of having not done a good enough job, right? If you're a craftsman and you did your best and you brought something to God and he said, this is crappy, You're not going to say, oh, that makes me so mad, right? You're going to say, I'm ashamed of having not been able to do better in general, right? That anger, both anger and shame are secondary emotions, right? And those are things that, whether we always realize it or not, we can choose to do. And how we do, and which one manifests says a lot about intentions, right? So God responds here to Cain, if you wanted this to be better, you just do better. Easy problem, like warning, buddy, you're here on thin ice with what you're doing, you should do better. Cain has a choice in how he responds to that, right? There are several choices he could have made. Responding with anger suggests that he feels caught and called out by something, is getting a little defensive, is blaming not himself for what happened, right? And that anger, as we'll see, is easy to misplace. This is what the effects of, and this is God's warning here too, by the way, this is what the effects of original sin unchecked can look like, right? That selfishness that settles in, that me-focusedness that clouds out and doesn't correctly perceive our place in the world and our relationship with God and others, right? It's a distorted view of self and of the world. And when that permeates our minds and our consciousness and how we look at things, the disorder only further and further builds into justifying horrendous things. This is the effect of sin taking root in Cain. And God says exactly that, right? Look out. You're right there with sin, but you don't have to be mastered by it, right? You can master sin, right? Like Cain, this is still a choice that you're making, and you still have different pathways open to you, but you are in the danger zone right now. And maybe reflect on your life and what you're doing. It's so easy to take our perception of the world as correct and to act on it, and to assume that we're justified. It's important to remember that sin and lies can color that perception, and we can be so sure we're justified and doing the right thing, and we can do terrible things because of that. The solution is to not trust our own perception, right? Like we see not with the eyes of these ones, but with the eyes of faith, right? And through trust in and reliance on God, we can see things differently from how we see them naturally with our own faculties. Cain's opportunity here was to say, God, that's not how I see things, but I get your point, and I defer to your judgment and view of the situation. You are greater than I am, and I yield to your perspective. But of course, somebody with that level of humility wouldn't be bringing God their leftovers. And so ultimately, it is that pride that is getting in Cain's way. And originally and now. And that's ultimately, if you want to not be going down this pathway yourself, pride is the thing to work on, and humility is the thing to cultivate, right? Be aware that you might not be right about everything can go a long way, but that can be hard. So anyway, God cautions Cain. We see that Cain is going down a road of anger And we see that God is suggesting that that is still within Cain's control, and he still has the ability to make a choice, which is very reflective of his parents, right? They also had choices, and they also had this voice shrouding their perception of the reality of the situation, saying, oh, of course this is like this, right? Like, no, surely you won't die if you eat that. Oh, God has definitely wronged you by liking Abel's things better than yours. You gave him offerings too. And why are my brother's offerings so much better than mine? I worked hard for that stuff that I gave to God, right? Like, it just gets in there and it repeats and it festers. And the next thing you know, your whole worldview is shaped by a lie. And you're angry at your brother who didn't do anything to you. We'll get to that. Anyway, that's that part. This is, of course, the part of the story that people remember, right? Cain invites his brother out into the field, that place of agriculture. And while they're out there, he kills him. Who is Cain blaming for the fact that God wasn't pleased with his sacrifice or his offering and lectured him? He's not directly blaming God, and he's certainly not blaming himself. He has, in his distorted worldview, decided if Abel hadn't made his son, Abel was doing all that to make me look bad. And if he hadn't done that, it wouldn't have been any problem. Me, right? This is still all about the way his anger is deflecting toward his brother is still all about him. More of that sinful, wrong worldview. And it gets to the point that he thinks, well, the obvious solution here is to kill my brother, and then that won't be a problem anymore. From making a slightly subpar offering, or maybe very subpar offering, we don't know, to God, to killing your brother, there are a lot of steps to take. And Cain took them very quickly. But that is what happens with that. Like, we haven't seen this in the Bible before because we don't have very many people yet. But this is a thing that fallen human nature is susceptible to. And if you want to be charitable toward Cain, you could argue he's the first person that's ever been exposed to trying to live with fallen human nature without having experienced anything else. Literally the first. Nobody could tell him how to do this. People hadn't learned how to deal with this yet. He was just thrown into, you have this fallen, broken nature. There's no one you can look at to know how to do this and how to live this way. Nobody can say, hey buddy, like, calm down, and maybe, like, there weren't tools around reframing or rethinking some of his feelings here, or he had no help or support in this, right? The very first person born in and doomed by sin. That would be a lot to try to deal with. It does not excuse murdering your brother, but when we look back at this, we think, oh, I've been living like that my whole life and I haven't killed my brother. So, like, this guy is just terrible. But my whole life, I saw examples of other people who were likewise born in the same state that I was, who had learned in many ways how to cope with and to deal with their natures and dispositions, and to generally try to be decent people. And I had role models and examples and people who were able to, teach me how to be a human in this state. Adam and Eve couldn't teach Cain how to be a human born into sin because they weren't. There wasn't anybody. There sort of were, we see, but they weren't in Cain's circle. They were way over there or whatever, right? Like, it's a very odd spot to be in for Cain. And I would argue that makes this less weird than it seems, just because it's all a new thing. And yeah, he deals with it really badly. And yeah, killing your brother, definitely not excusable. But what an interesting thing to have to try to deal with, and an unfortunate thing for Cain. Also, Abel does so much better, and he's basically in the same spot. So like, the guy only gets so much slack. But it would be kind of a rough situation. Anyway, he kills his brother out of misplaced anger, and kind of cements his pathway into one of sin. Considering what happened with his parents, I don't know why he would think he could get away with this. Again, like, the perception of reality is he knew God, right? Like, not like you and I knew God, but like he had chats with the guy. Like, he knew a place to go to be where God was, to give him physical things and to have a chat with him. He knew God. And he somehow thought, oh, but God doesn't go into the field. I can go out into the field, and because I've never seen God out in the field, so I can go out there and kill my brother, and God won't know that I did it. He didn't know God very well, right? And that becomes apparent. So God, like he did with Adam and Eve, shows up and asks a question. And the question here is, where is Abel, your brother? And that's where we get the oft-quoted, am I my brother's keeper? Which also, as a question, shows how far gone his attitude is. Because the answer is, of course, yes. Yes, you are. As the quotes from a couple of different popes listed in this lesson highlight, the church's answer to that is, yes, duh. Of course you are your brother's keeper, and your brother is everyone. And most of the problems humanity faces are because we don't think that's true. But even more so, or more obviously so, there are, Cain, in your sphere of existence, 4 people. Mom, dad, you, your brother. Is your point that you have no responsibility for those other 3 people, and that you're entirely on your own and not obligated to be concerned about or to have any care or regard for only 3 other people who happen to be your blood family? That's your argument here is, oh, that's not my problem, he's just my brother. Like, the question itself shows how far gone he is, right? Because the answer is, of course, yes. And he assumes that it is, of course, no. And that's the core problem, right? Or another manifestation of it. And then God says, yeah, no, like, I know what happened. I can see what's happening in the field. It's not some magical place that I can't go. And, by the way, your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Setting the stage for another thing that matters through all of the Bible. Abel is dead, and he is not dead. His blood, his life, is yet crying out to God after he's dead. So we're seeing things to do with life and death here, and we're seeing from the beginning, the first death, that death is not death. God is still aware of and talking to dead Abel. Because dead isn't dead. Especially for somebody who is on good terms with God. What a fascinating thing. From the beginning, alive is not alive. Look at Cain. We'll get to that as we progress here. And dead is not dead. From the beginning. Those are just such important themes. And what is Cain's punishment? Speaking of life and death, you think, as we say many places, if you sin, you die. But again, here we're setting up, I would say, the theologically more accurate and more abstract and profound version of what this is, which is life isn't life and death isn't death, right? What happens when you sin, what happened to Adam and Eve, and what happens here to Cain, is you are cut off from God. Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, and Cain is exiled from the farm, wherever he's been with God, right? He becomes a wanderer on the earth and doesn't get to settle in until the soil. But this isn't about you have to change jobs. This is ultimately about you're not welcome in the presence of God anymore. And that very profoundly is the result of sin, right? More than, because we see it all the time, right? I commit a bad sin, a mortal sin, by words that means I should be dead, and yet I'm still breathing. So how am I dead? Well, what happened is I have been cut off from the presence of God, right? I have been exiled. And God is life and the thing that gives my life meaning. And in the higher and more profound way, the thing that gives me the kind of life that lasts rather than the kind of life that doesn't. And the kind of life that can be guaranteed versus the kind of life that is guaranteed to end. This is the effect of sin, is you are cut off from God. And that is here what happens to Cain. Here Cain exhibits the exact same mentality and behavior. Oh, this is too much for me. I can't possibly bear this punishment, right? Like, not, thank you God for not ending my life, which eye for an eye, right? Like, that is the just, even outcome there, right? You kill somebody, you are killed. God shows mercy and says, nope, I'm not going to kill you, but you can't be with me now. So, bye. And Cain, instead of saying, thank you, Lord, for your gracious mercy, says, how could you do that to me? And suddenly, he's really concerned about the possibility of murder. If you send me out there, there are people who will murder me. And that would be like, you couldn't possibly let such a horrible thing happen as for someone to murder someone else, God. Like, you're exposing me to all of those, me, and an innocent guy, to all of those murderers. You couldn't possibly like do that to me, right? This is like, you're calling BS on this, right? Like, this is actually a relatively merciful thing under the circumstances, and Cain is still making it all about him, right? This does not seem like he's arguing in good faith to me. And that does seem to be kind of God's takeaway as well. But we also see where I got ahead of myself a little bit before, that this clearly is implied that he's not going to be in the presence of, not implied, it's clear that he's not going to be in the presence of God anymore. And he understands that. And again, if you want to be a little charitable to him, you could argue that that's the point that he thinks is unacceptable, right? If you want to say he's genuinely remorseful, which I don't think he is, then the part of the punishment that would be unacceptable would be, I can't tolerate being outside of the presence of God. But to me, this reads more like, oh, poor me, and not like, how do I live without you, God? He does also seem to predominantly be concerned about his own survival and well-being, when his main point is those people are all those randoms out there will surely find and kill me, and not, how is life meaningful without you, my God, right? Like, we see where his head is, right? This is, at this point, not a good guy, and he is not repenting. And God is still showing mercy. In the context, well, we'll come back to it. We'll finish one more, and then we'll elaborate on the metaphor as well. God's counterpoint to, oh, poor me, this punishment is so hard. Cain says, oh, it'll be so hard for me because all of these murderers are going to kill me. And God says, oh, that's your only problem? I can fix that. No big deal. I'll just take vengeance sevenfold on anyone who harms you, and I will in some way make that visibly clear so that they'll all leave you alone. And you can then, of course, thrive out there without me among all these other people. If that was your only problem with that, easy, solved. Not a problem. Here's protection, a mark that is, we'll get to the metaphor part of this in just a second, and now scram and go have fun with those possible murderers. Your people now, because you're not one of mine. And that's that branch of this family getting removed. Alluded in the intro, there's an important metaphorical aspect or typological aspect to all of this as well, right? Wherein, as much as we would like to be Abel, we're not, right? Abel is Jesus and the church, and Cain is those of us born into sin, right? God could have seen us born into sin and our sins and said, no, we don't need that. We're just going to do away with that. But he didn't. He said, I'm going to have mercy on you. But with that sin, you cannot be in my presence. So you are cut off, but I'm not going to kill you. And in fact, I'm going to endeavor to preserve your life. With the goal of bringing, this never happens to Cain, right? This is just us. With the goal of coming back into the presence of and into union with God. But for our journey and along the way, God, a part of bringing us back is God does ultimately seal us with a mark that protects our lives in the land of wickedness and death. And that becomes an important part of our way back into the presence of God. Versus our brother, Abel Jesus, whom we killed, who didn't die, whose blood did cry out, while Abel's blood was, we don't know what Abel's blood was saying other than Cain killed me. But Jesus, from life after death, said, forgive them and bring them back. And that blood itself paid the debt of the sin we committed. And instead of creating a separation between us and God, the blood of Jesus that cries out restores the union between humanity and God. So what Jesus does undoes, in a sense, what happens here, or completes it. So there's so much typology and foreshadowing in the early part of Genesis. It's everywhere, and it's worth thinking about some. But in the more immediate context of the story, Cain is leaving, and right now Adam and Eve have no other children. So we're back to just the two for the time being. Here we get to the first of many genealogies, and this one's not particularly relevant. So we'll go fast and highlight just a couple points. First key point, we have our first example of someone having more than one wife in the form of Lamech, suggesting that originally and ordinarily that was not the thing, and that being a thing was divergence from. Originally, people were monogamous, and it was a divergence from that, that from a guy who is clearly a jerk. We'll get to that. So that's interesting. And then you get some of this kind of mythological idea of, well, this guy was the ancestor of everybody who played the lyre and pipe, and this guy, that sort of thing, right? Like, we're trying to explain. The author is trying to explain like professions and other stuff that like we don't need to put a lot of weight on. But Cain had a wife. Where did she come from? When, again, if the story is taken literally, there were only Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. Eve isn't his wife. Where did she come from? You don't have any other women. Already covered that, not worth dwelling on, but anyway, Cain has descendants and a family line, but they're exiled from God and are not going to be really terribly relevant to the rest of the story because they got cut off, and that's what happens when you get cut off. Here we see, most importantly, how the attitude of people cut off from God develops, right? Cain's distorted perception persists to his descendants, right? Lamech thinks it's cool to say if Cain is avenged sevenfold, Lamech is avenged 77-fold because I have escalated violence upon people. And I have done the avenging versus God doing it for me. And that makes me so cool. Is his perception of that, right? Like, that's clearly a thing he goes around telling people a lot if it's worth getting quoted. But of course, if you ask God, that is an incredibly distorted and broken worldview. So Cain's worldview, already broken and distorted, makes it all that much harder for his descendants to walk a path in line with God. And that does reflect a thing that is very much still the case. If the parents go astray, it is much harder for the children. And that makes it very easy to create a compounding sequence of events over generations where people grow farther and farther away from God. Now that, and this follows kind of a pattern that will also happen as we're separating out a line that's not important. We'll lay out some of the genealogy and what happens, like, this is the end of their story, so here's a little bit of what happens. Now jump back to the important part. That's what we're doing here. So back to Adam and Eve, who's not named here otherwise other than his wife in this bit, but we know who she is. They have now their third child, Seth. And Seth has Enosh. So the main line from Adam and Eve continues. There can be fairly sparse storytelling around some of these things in Genesis, right? Like, we get the key points about mostly Cain's interaction with God. Cain or Abel is the good one, and we get nothing from his perspective. We get nothing from the parents' perspective during all of this. It's all Cain's relationship with God. Because from a point of view of looking at sin and its effect on humanity, that's the important part, right? We're not here to give all the drama of how did Eve react when she heard that her son died or her other son was exiled? And if you were doing this on TV, especially now, you'd have to show the emotional scene where she finds out. And we're not playing this for all of the dramatic effect, right? We're playing it for the theological effect, which is, what is the effect of sin on humanity? And Cain is the relevant one because he's us, right? Even though he's the one who gets cut off and we don't come back to that anymore, he's us, and that's us. The Seth and beyond, that's the part that's not us, right? That leads to better than us. Like, that's the hopeful part. And it's great that the story's about that. But if we're to relate to anyone in the story, it's the one who gets all the screen time, it's Cain. And the fact that there is a branch that's not Cain, that's hope. That's the promise of salvation. And that's what the entire rest of the book after that is about. This has been an overview of Lesson 4 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.